Great, so we're almost at the end of our retouching process. One final thing that you may want to do with the image is, for example, run a gradient map over the top of your image. So what is a gradient map? Well, gradient maps can be used for creating things like color grades. So you might see with certain photographers, they have a certain look about their photography. Maybe the shadows are quite blue and then the highlights and the midtones are warm. So that's one way that we can create a certain look, a bit like a filter maybe on Instagram or something like that. But we can also use gradient maps to help neutralize color within an image. We can see with this photo, it's mostly looking okay in terms of the color range, but you may want to neutralize some of the skin tones a little. So we can see there's a little bit of red in the face over here. It's maybe a little bit warmer down here, even a little bit of green in the shadows and midtones. We can see that around the décolletage compared to the face, there is a shift in the hue there. So we may want to try and neutralize the skin so it's more even across the face and also the rest of the body. So in order to do that, we can use a gradient map. So part of the gradient map process is to either bring in a sample image that you may want to sample some colors from, or you can create your own sample colors for your highlights, your midtones and your shadows within the file itself. So we'll do that in this particular workflow. So to add our own sample layer, what we're going to do is come across and just in the layers panel, add a new empty layer. And then I'm just going to rename that sample. And then we're going to make sure we're on the brush tool, and I'm just going to increase the brush size a little there. And what we're going to do is sample some colors within this image. Coming across, I'll find something that should be a highlight within the skin tone. So maybe over here on the cheek, and holding down Option or Alt, I'll just click within there. When you are sampling color, always make sure that you're sampling a spot that there's good representation of the area that you're trying to sample. And then once you've sampled that, what we'll do is come up and paint an area within the sample layer. Okay, so that's our highlight color. Then I'll try and find a mid-tone, maybe over here on the forehead. If I come in and just select a color from there and sample that as my foreground color. I'm not too concerned about where I'm painting because it is on a separate layer. It's just a sample layer that we'll get rid of. And then I'm finding a shadow. So probably in here, it's a good representation of the color in the shadows of the skin. Cool, so now I've got my 3 different ranges there, and I'm going to use these to create my gradient map. So to add a gradient map to the document, then I can come across, I can either use my adjustments layer there. We've got our gradient map down here. Otherwise, I can also do it from the layer panel. I've got my adjustment layer down the bottom of my layers panel, and I'll just go down to my gradient map almost at the bottom there to add the gradient map. Now at the moment it's over the top of my sample, so my samples have been neutralized there. I'm just going to drag the gradient map underneath so that sample is on top. And I'll just double click on the gradient map to rename it map skin. And what we're going to do is now set the properties for this gradient map. So to get into the properties for the gradient, I'm going to come across and open up the properties panel here, and we can see that we've got a gradient that's running from dark to light here. Now, if I want to sample or change the sample colors within here, what I've got to do is just click within the gradient map, and then I've got the gradient editor. So it's here that I can go in and I can change the color of the shadows, and I can also change the color of the highlights based off of the samples that I've got there. Now, one important step when you are using this gradient map editor is you want to make sure that in the layers panel, you've got that gradient map layer selected, but you also want to make sure that you've also got this gradient properties thumbnail selected, not the actual mask itself. Because if you've got the mask selected, you're only going to be sampling white from here. So make sure that you do have the gradient map icon selected. Great, so I'll come across and I'm going to change the color of the highlight by clicking on the stop for the highlight there, double clicking on the stop for the highlight there, and then I'll just move that window out of the way and hovering over the top of my sample layer, making sure as well that up the top here when I'm sampling this, from the sample size, I want to sample 5 by 5 average, which means it's going to pick up 5 pixels around the sample area and basically create the average out of those. And also I want to make sure that I'm sampling from all of the layers. and I'll come across and I'm just going to select the highlight color. We can see that adds that color there to the stop, and you can see the image change when I do that. I'll click OK. I'm going to add another stop in here just by clicking somewhere in the middle, and that's going to be my midtone. So again, I'm going to double click on the midtone color, and rather than choosing a color from here, I'll use my color picker to click on the midtone that I've set there, and then click OK. And then finally, I've got the shadow area. I'll come in and I'll open up the options for that, and then I'll click onto the shadow area that I've got available from my sample, and then I'll click OK. Now you may want to play around with this slider. If you want more contrast, you can always drag this shadows to the right, and you can see it's going to deepen the shadows a little bit there. I can also drag these highlights to the left, and that's just changing the location. Same with the midtones, I can sort of play around where they sit. In terms of deciding where you can eyeball this, you can also, if I double click onto the actual stop for it, I've got a brightness level there. It's saying that it's 99% brightness. So I have seen people actually use that as an indication of where to place this. So you could move this across to the 99 location. If I go into the shadows and check where the brightness level is in there, that's sitting at 18%. So I could drag this across to the location of 18. Although in doing that, it's looking a little bit too dark. So I might actually just leave it at about 10% there. Great, so I've applied that gradient map. I'm going to click OK on that, and then I can come in and I can hide that sample layer. I no longer need that. All right, so how do we apply this to the skin? Well, we've got to map this gradient map to the skin tone. And we can do that by sampling the skin and creating a mask. So I'll make sure that I've got the mask selected back here in my layers panel on the map skin layer. And then what I'm going to do is come across and choose my select menu and go down to my color range. And then within this color range window, what I can do is take a look at the preview and work out what part of the image I need to select, which is the skin. I can use my little eyedropper there to click on parts of the skin to choose a certain area. So I'll choose the forehead there, and then what I'm going to do is bring the fuzziness down, which we can see that in doing that, it's reducing the amount of skin area that's being selected as part of this, but it's also reducing these areas out here. So I'm just adjusting this fuzziness level until I'm happy with the level of the mask for the gradient map. I might bring it up so that I've got a lot of the skin still selected, and then I can always paint on this mask after the fact. So I'll click OK on this, and we can see that the gradient map is now running across the image. It is quite heavy still on some of the hair and the eyes. So what I'm going to have to do is brush away in black to hide the effect on those areas. And I can do that by coming across to the mask, holding down my Option key or Alt, clicking on that, and basically what I want to do is anywhere that I don't want that gradient map to appear, such as the hair, the eyes, and the lips, I'll paint that out using black. So with the brush tool selected, coming down, making sure that I've got black selected as my foreground color, and I'll just increase the size of the brush because I can work quite quickly over these areas where I don't need to neutralize. And coming in, just painting over this part of the hair. I might just change the brush setting so that the hardness is down and a little bit softer, so I can get in a little bit closer over here. And I'll reduce the brush down over the top here because I definitely don't want that gradient map over the top of this area because it's basically warming up that white top. And then I also want to be careful with the eyes and the lips because they were looking like they had the gradient map on them. So I'll just reduce the size of the brush and black out the eyes so that we don't have the gradient map running over the top of those. And then same with the lips, you want to keep those warmer pink color rather than the neutral color. And now we can go back in and I'll just Option or Alt click on this, and we can see that I've managed to mask out the gradient map over those other areas. And you just want to pay close attention to these edges here and make sure that we don't have the gradient map running over these areas. over here. Looks like she's got foundation on her top, so we'll just get rid of that. Cool. Now, if you still find the effect is quite intense on the skin, because we've done this on a separate layer, it's a non-destructive way of working. I can come across and I can change the opacity level of that. So if I come up to my opacity here and I'll just drag that to the left, and so I'll bring it down to about 50%, so we can still see we're getting some of the original colors coming through. So I'll turn that off so we can see that's how it was. And then now with the gradient map, it's just helped to neutralize that. Might bring the opacity level up just a little bit more to make the skin a little bit more neutral. And then turning it off there and then back on again. So yeah, we can see how gradient maps can just help even our skin tone, especially if you've got areas that are maybe looking a little bit red, other areas that are looking a little bit green. It can help to just give more of a consistent color across the skin. Okay, so gradient maps can also be used to give a color grade to your images. So if you wanted to have a particular look to your photos, you could add a gradient map to, for example, cool the shadows down and then warm up the highlights. So to do that, we just want to make sure I've got the top layer selected there, and I'll come down to my adjustment layer button here and I'll go down to my gradient map again. And from my gradient map at the bottom there, I will come across and choose the properties panel here and go in and select the gradient map just by clicking on it, and that'll open up the gradient editor. And so yeah, there are a number of different ways you could approach this, but one common way to use a gradient map over the top for a particular look is to cool off the shadows. So I can double click onto the tab there for the stop for the shadows, and then I'll come in here and I'll choose like a teal, like a darker teal color there for that. And then I'll come over to the highlights and double click on the stop for the highlight and move the hue slider into the warmer areas here, and I'll just choose a brighter yellow for the highlights and click OK on that. I'll come out of the gradient editor by clicking OK there. So now we've got the gradient map layer sitting over the top. So I'll just rename this one my color grade, and in doing that, I want to change the way that this blends with all the layers underneath, and I can do that through my blending mode that I've got here in the layers panel. So I'll click on that drop down, and I can come down to this section here. These are the areas that will soften and blend the gradient map with what's underneath. So if I choose the soft light, that's often a blending mode that is used for gradient maps and creating color grades. And that's quite an intense color grade at the moment. So I would just change the opacity level of that in the layers panel. So while it's selected, I could just drag that down to the left. And we can see there that the original image is starting to show back through here. But I can see that the colors here in the shadows are looking a little bit cooler. And then I've got more warmth here in the highlights. I can turn that off, so that's where it was. And that's the gradient color grade over the top. So again, this is just another way you can create a certain look to your photos using the gradient map adjustment layer.